Hello and welcome to the
I watched the Russian.
in my opinion, one of the Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Brussels Horizon podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Brent Johnson, and just to highlight how special he is, I have about 4 people on Twitter whom I check out every day, and Brent is one of them for 2 reasons. He's very informative, he knows what he's talking about, and he's also very entertaining. I have to admire you Brent, because he does not shy away from even a 200 follower account to engage with them in a prolonged discussion. So there is no arrogance. There's not an arrogant bone in Brent's body. That is great. He's also on Substack. You have to check it out. He got a glowing endorsement from Doomberg, who have been regular guests on this show as well, and I know that every one of our viewers and listeners love. So if they like Brent, you should as well. You also have your own podcast. I listened to a couple of recent episodes, one on the current world order, on currencies, the demise or not demise of the US dollar. Very interesting. And the great thing about Brent is he explains things in a way that makes it accessible to the non-professionals. You don't have to be an expert. If you're interested in geopolitics, in currency, where things are going, he's the guy to go to. And what's also like very much, you have some fantastic one-liners. There is one I have been using myself. I always give you credit. But I've been using this one for a very long time when I talk to people about the demise of the dollar, that just because something is inevitable, it's not imminent. Maybe we can start our conversation off with, what do you mean by that? In which context did you use this fantastic line?
Well, I appreciate you giving me credit, but I have to give credit to somebody else. I think that I got that from Rick Rule, and I think Rick Rule got it from Doug Casey. So it's been handed down over the years.
So Chinese whispers.
But to me, it's literally the most important thing. Because so many people, and look, I have been guilty of this myself. This is why I know that it's an important thing to really step back and think about, is because if you look at something and you can see all the problems with it, and you know that it just can't possibly stay like that, there's a lot of truth to that. When something is fundamentally wrong, it will eventually come to an end. But these things, especially these big macro issues, can literally take years, if not decades, to play out. And most people, even if they claim to be a long-term investor, a 20-year investment is a very long-term investment. And the peaks and valleys along the way can knock many people out. And there's so many people that I talk to, because I typically deal with individuals, kind of the retail investment network, not necessarily professional pension fund managers or hedge fund managers. And I talk to so many people who will have a position based on the fundamental understanding of the way things ought to be, or the way things that the way things they think things should be. And they may have some good fundamental points, but that doesn't mean that there aren't enormous forces on the other side keeping it going. Government's a perfect example of this, right? I mean, I think we all know that governments are inefficient. There's a bunch of waste. They're bureaucratic machines that don't necessarily push things forward at the rate that they should. Yet governments last for a really long time, right? They're very powerful, and they can keep things going that otherwise would not continue going. And so that's why I say it all the time, because to me, it's one of the most important things that the retail investors miss.
One of the questions I have, because I came across this in one of your most recent podcasts, and I'm ashamed to say, until very recently, I wasn't exactly aware what the details about this are. So you might gonna shake your head, but I'm sure there are many among our listeners and viewers who hear this all the time as well, but they don't know really what it is. So what is the DXY, and why does it matter?
Okay. The DXY is the dollar index. It's basically a way to track the dollar versus a basket of other countries. And it's about 50% the euro and like 15% the yen. And then it's a handful of other countries like London, and I think the Swedish kroner's in there. Anyway, it's a basket against about 5 or 6 different currencies, but it basically measures the strength of the dollar against other major currencies. There's also a similar thing called the ADXY, which is the Asian dollar index, which tracks the dollar versus a number of Asian currencies, smaller, more emerging market type currencies. But it's really just a way to measure the US dollar versus its currency peers on a broad basis. And a lot of people think that doesn't matter, but it actually matters a lot. And that's kind of why I pound the table on the dollar so much, because I think a lot of people, maybe not in Europe, I think people in Europe have a much better understanding of how important currency is. But many Americans, because we've grown up with the dollar, we only have to think in dollar terms. We've never had to think in 2 or 3 different currencies. Whereas my guess is you kind of grew up thinking about 2 or 3 different currencies at once.
Very true. In one of your recent podcasts, you said if the DXY goes to 115, things could start to break. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I think a good example would be if we look back at 2022. So in 2022, the Fed started raising interest rates. The reason this is important for the whole world, and not just for the United States, is that the whole world uses dollar funding to run their businesses, to run their governments, run their economies. Or at least the dollar plays into it on a big level, because many of the imported commodities to run those economies are priced in US dollars. So as the dollar goes higher, it puts enormous pressure not just on the United States, but on the rest of the world. And if it gets too expensive, it's almost, if you borrow, let's just say you have a shoe factory, right? And you're making shoes and you borrow $1 million because you want to make some improvements on your factory and buy a couple trucks to ship those shoes around to the stores. Well, that's fine, but if the dollar then rises 10% versus the euro, let's say you're based in Europe, now all of a sudden it's almost like owing 1.1 million rather than owing $1 million. And if that continues, even though you're servicing that debt over time, you're really not ever paying off the principal. And if it goes up too much, it can actually cause you to miss a payment or makes you unable to meet those dollar obligations. And then you get into default scenarios, and then you get into a credit contraction. And this is the way that a credit contraction can lead to a crisis. In fact, if you were to look at every either large regional or global crisis that we have had over the last 40 or 50 years, almost every one of them has some element of one currency rising versus another as the catalyst that caused the crisis. There was, maybe it was 10 years ago, a number of investors, or I can't remember if it was in Slovakia, the Slovak Republic, but there was some place in Eastern Europe that had borrowed for their mortgages in Swiss francs because the Swiss franc was lower financing costs. It had lower interest rates. But then when the Swiss franc rose versus those Eastern European currencies, those borrowers could no longer meet those loan obligations, and they started defaulting on their mortgages, and it caused a little bit of a mini crisis there. That's a perfect example of how a rising dollar can cause problems, really all over the world. And if we look back to 2022, there's 4 very good examples of what I'm talking about. In 2022, the DXY, went to a 30-year high, and I think it went to like 114. I think 114 was kind of its high, kind of at the end of September. But in the month leading up to that high in the DXY, several things happened. First of all, in the UK, their gilt market, which is their treasury market, went into crisis, and the Bank of England had to bail it out. At the same time, the Bank of Japan had to intervene to prop up both the currency of Japan, the yen, and the JGB market, which is their treasury market. At about the same time, the ECB raised interest rates for the first time in, I think, 10 or 12 years. But they simultaneously had to set up a facility to buy Italian bonds because the yields on Italian bonds were spiking. And while all of this was going on, China's downturn in their stock market and their real estate market sped up or really started to move down with speed. That's not a coincidence that all those things happened while the DXY was at a 30-year high. In fact, I don't know whether the DXY causes it or whether the DXY rises in sympathy with it. I just know that the correlation is close to 100%. So that's why following the DXY, even if you're not a currency trader, it's very important to get a gauge of what's going on in the world. Typically, the dollar, if things are going well, then the dollar is going down. The problem is whenever there's a crisis, the dollar goes up. So if the dollar goes down, that actually perpetuates the system. That keeps everything functioning. It's when the dollar rises that things break and then changes have to be made.
Do you think is this mostly caused by market forces, or is this something that the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Federal Reserve know? There was a headline just a couple of days ago in the Financial Times that said Trump's tariffs are backfiring. The value of the dollar is declining. And so my question to you is the value of the dollar declining because Trump's tariffs, and I would like to talk about those in a couple of minutes, because those tariffs are backfiring, or is it because of what you just described, that both the Federal Reserve and the Treasury say if the DXY gets too high, things start to break also in the economies of our allies, and we don't want that to happen?
So it's a little bit of both. So I need to give people a little bit of financial history in order to understand this. So when I say the rest of the world uses dollars for funding, that's not a joke. That is, the US dollar is literally the world's money. And to give you an example, coming out of World War II, we had this thing called the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the US dollar was tied to gold, and then the other currencies were tied to the US dollar. Well, in 1972, due to a number of spending out of control, Nixon took the United States off the U.S. dollar. Or sorry, took the United States off the gold standard. So the dollar was no longer linked to gold. But right around the same time, the U.S. came to an agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that they would provide help them with develop their country, develop their infrastructure, provide defense, keep their family in power, and in exchange, they would price all of their oil in US dollars. And because they're the biggest oil producer at the time, and because the whole world needed Saudi oil in order to run their economies, everybody needed dollars to buy that oil. Now, even before that, many entities and institutions around the world were already transacting in dollars, but that really turbocharged it. And so from the early, it started in the 50s and 60s, but then with that agreement in the 70s, it really turbocharged it. And now the size, and what they call these, a dollar outside the United States is referred to as a Eurodollar. It's not a euro, it's not the euro currency, it's just a dollar outside the United States. So this Eurodollar market took off incredibly after 1972. And that's also about the time that globalization really started to take off. And we all know what that did over the next 30 or 40 years. And so as the world became more globalized, as the Eurodollar market expanded, the demand for dollars outside the United States is much bigger than the demand for dollars inside the United States. And a lot of people know that the United States owes $37 trillion. What most people don't know is that the rest of the world outside the United States also owe over $30 trillion. By some estimates, it's up to 60 or 70 trillion. And if you start to count derivatives and other off-balance sheet items, it could be hundreds of trillions outside the United States. And here's the kicker. They don't owe it to the United States. They owe it to each other. So it's France making a loan to a factory in Turkey. It's Egypt extending vendor financing to a trading partner in Tunisia. It's Japan buying rubber from a supplier in the Philippines and using dollars on the invoice. You add all that up, there's all this dollar demand outside the United States. That's Eurodollars. And so that's why it's so hard for the rest of the world to move away from the dollar, not because necessarily the U.S. makes them do it, but because market forces do. And if you want, so let's say that you're this shoe manufacturer that I talked about. You took a dollar loan from a French bank. And now all of a sudden, you like what the BRICS countries are saying. You don't really like Donald Trump. You don't really like what the U.S. is doing, how they're treating the rest of the world. You want to start using this other currency. Well, that's fine that you want to do that. But the French bank still wants dollars. So how do you get away from using dollars when you have to pay that dollar loan? So let's say you enter into business with you're selling shoes to somebody in India and they pay you in rupees. Well, you've just bought rupees, but you still owe France dollars. And in the meantime, the rupee is falling versus the dollar. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for you to service that dollar debt. As you don't service that dollar debt, then your balance sheet starts to come under pressure. Banks will no longer loan you money because you've missed a few payments. Your suppliers will no longer ship you rubber to make your shoes. And so now all of a sudden you go out of business. That is the market punishing somebody trying to leave the US dollar market, with the US not having to do anything about it. So going back to I know this has been kind of a long-winded answer.
No, but this is great. I think this is so fascinating because many people don't know this. So this is incredibly interesting.
This is exactly right. And so when you come back to, does the US knows this? Yes, the US knows this. They don't always use the dollar as a weapon, but they have the ability to use this as a weapon when and if they choose to do so. I know for a fact that they know how to do this. This is not speculation on my part. Now, they don't always do it, and they don't want the world to blow up in a steaming pile of smoke, but if they need to use that to further their interests, they know how to do it. Now, you made a good point initially, but doesn't that hurt U.S. allies, and doesn't that hurt the United States as well? And the short answer is yes, it absolutely does. But let's think about this from a competitive standpoint. Obviously, in a perfect world, everybody would grow together and everybody would get along and everybody would, be making profits and it would just be a nice environment. But that's not always the way the real world is. And sometimes you get into trade wars and sometimes you get into real wars in order to settle differences. And whenever you enter a competition, there's a possibility that even though you might win, you're probably going to get hit during the competition. If we use a boxing match as an example, nobody goes into
in your last podcast. Yeah, it's exactly. A great analogy.
Nobody goes into a boxing match expecting not to get hit. Of course you're going to get hit. You're going into a fight. But the fight isn't decided on who gets hit. The fight gets decided on who is standing at the end of everybody getting hit. And so my point when people say, the U.S. can't do this because it will hurt them as well, you're right, it will hurt the United States. But the United States, for all its problems, and listen, it has many problems, too many to list. But despite all those problems, it still has the system and the dollar and many other advantages that the rest of the world just doesn't have. And that gives them the ability to withstand pain more than most others and throw knockout blows the way the others cannot. So I would never sit here and say that the dollar, gives immunity to pain to the United States. That's not the case at all. They can experience tremendous pain. I think 2008 and 2020 did a very good job of showing that. But it doesn't mean that they're going to get knocked out from it. And it's my belief that if it comes to that, if the U.S. ever does get completely knocked out economically due to either, a trade war or a real war or whatever it is, it will come after all of the other economies and all the other currencies have failed before it. Not because the U.S. deserves to have this position, it's just the way it is. And that's another thing that I'd like to talk about is you have to look at the world as it is, not as you want it to be, especially if you're investing your hard-earned money. It's one thing to want the world to be a certain way, but if you're putting your hard-earned money on the line, that you spent hours and hours to make that money. You spent time away from your family. You went to school for all these years. Once you start making that money, you don't just want to throw it away because you want the world to be a certain way. And this is the way the world currently is. And can it change? It can absolutely change, but it won't change without tremendous volatility. And so I think, and when, as we said before, when it's volatile, the dollar tends to rise. So you kind of get into this vicious cycle.
One of the things I find quite interesting, and just you mentioned, I believe it is our common friend Tony Nash who recently had an interesting post that even the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, 80% of it is denominated in dollars. So even the Chinese, for their foreign policy or their geopolitical strategic scheming, use the dollar. I remember must have been about 10 years ago. There was all this. Well, actually, I think it's even longer, maybe almost 20 years ago, when there were all these conversations about the horrible U.S. trade deficit, right? The United States have a negative trade balance, and they consume too much, they buy too much. It's all very, very bad. But if we look now at the tariff wars, or whatever you want to call it, the tariff policy of the United States, it turns out that if you import a lot, but not export as much to certain countries, that your tariffs tend to hurt them much more than they hurt you. I think the numbers, for example, for Mexico is Mexican exports to the United States are something around 33% of their GDP, but American exports to Mexico are like 2% of GDP. So what Donald Trump is doing, I don't want to get too political in the sense of, do we like Donald Trump, don't we like Donald Trump, but if we try to objectively analyze his policies, given those conditions and also the situation with the currency that you described, that makes tariffs potentially a very powerful weapon because ironically, let's say Canada puts a 10% tariff on American imports. But if at the same time the dollar is rising, let's say by 10%, that also at least partially offsets those additional tariffs. So it appears to me that what Donald Trump's policy is revealing is that despite, as you said, the very long list of problems the United States have, they are still very powerful. And if they use that power, they are forced to be reckoned with.
Absolutely. And I for a long time, and I'm going to take a step back because I think this is really important to understand. A friend of mine named Michael Every, he works for a company called Rabobank, which is a Dutch bank. He lives in Asia, but it's a Dutch bank. He has written a report, and he's been right about this for several years that this is where it's heading, but he wrote a report in the fall called Grand Macro Strategy. And and the reason this is important is for a long time, we would look at different policies in silos. So as an example, we would look at United States trade policy, we would look at United States military policy, we would look at United States monetary policy, we would look at social policy as four separate things. Now, with Trump coming in, he's saying, no. There's only one policy, and that is America first. And we are going to apply that policy to all of those different silos. There's no longer different strategies for different things. Everything is going to be focused on that one thing. And as part of that, tariffs, and part of that is to bring good jobs back to the United States. Over the last 30, 40 years, as globalization happened, where labor was cheaper, manufacturing would move to those cheaper places, and then they would ship the goods back to the United States. So as a result, wages in the United States did not keep up with inflation and the growth of asset prices and home prices, and so you have a widening wealth inequality gap. And part of the reason Trump won, again, whether you like him or not, part of the reason he won is he addressed those points and he said, we need to change this. The only way to change that is to bring those jobs back here. And the only way to bring those jobs back here is to level the playing field on a trade policy. And many of the countries that do not want the U.S. to put tariffs on goods coming into the United States have tariffs on goods from the United States going into those countries. And so it's a little bit hypocritical, to say that it can't work when these other countries are using it. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be pain in doing this. And this, to get back to the tariffs, are tariffs inflationary? And tariffs, in general, yes, are inflationary. But it seems to me that every time this topic comes up, everybody says they are automatically bad and they are automatically going to hurt the United States. And it's not that those 2 points are wrong, it's just that it doesn't tell the whole story. It's also going to hurt those other countries. When they talk to your point, when you look at how much of GDP of the United States is generated by exporting stuff to Canada, it's like 5%. But if you look at Canada and Mexico, importing or exporting into the United States. It's like 20 or 30% of their economies. So there's no way that it's going to hurt the United States economy that has 5% exposure and not hurt Mexico or Canada that has 20 or 30% exposure. And the only way to get some of those manufacturing jobs back into the United States is to say, hey, don't import them into the United States, build your factory here, make those goods in the United States, and you no longer have the tariffs. And the thing is, it's really, I don't know of any other way to get manufacturing and good jobs and higher wages back into the United States other than trying this. Now, I'm not saying that this is definitely going to work. I'm just saying that the people who automatically say it won't work are speculating, and there's no real proof that it won't work. And while I think it could cause a lot of pain in the very short term, I don't know how else to get to a good solution in the medium to long term other than going through this short-term pain. I don't know if I answered your question right there or not, but that's kind of how I see it.
No, I think you did. And I have an immediate follow-up question, which is, it seems at the moment from outside observer that within the American economy, a certain optimistic spirit is taking hold again. So the talk of Trump about the golden age might be hyperbolic, but there is a sentiment that appears to be very optimistic. And you mentioned before, Bretton Woods, the dollar was tied to gold. Then you had the arrangement with Saudi Arabia, so the main resource, oil, was the key. Do you think that in the future, because this is still an ongoing discussion that comes up, I feel like every 2 days, about the future demise and weakness of the dollar and the US economy. But of course, if the US economy should roar again, that would also strengthen the position of the US dollar, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is these tariffs, if Trump follows through on these tariffs, there's a couple ways that this is bullish for the dollar or potentially bullish for the dollar. Again, we just don't, I speculate just like everybody else. I try to put probabilities on things, but nobody knows for sure. But if tariffs go up, it essentially means the rest of the world is getting fewer dollars than they were before. I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but that's fairly accurate. And we talked about that Eurodollar market and all that Eurodollar debt. If the rest of the world is getting fewer dollars than they were before, it becomes increasingly hard for them to meet their debt servicing costs and their financing costs and their other, needed inputs that take place in dollars. And so if the supply goes down, but the demand is still there, what does that do to price? That pushes price higher. So that's how the dollar can go higher. Now, at the same time, if the Trump policies continue to make the U.S. the best economy in the world, not necessarily great, but just better than the other options, people will still want to invest in the United States. And if you're going to invest in the United States, guess what you need? You need dollars. If you want to buy an apartment in Miami, and let's say you live in Brazil, but you want to buy an apartment in Miami, you can't buy that apartment with Brazilian real. You need U.S. dollars to do it. If you want to, buy Apple, you can't buy Apple with Turkish lira. You need dollars to do it. And that's what we've seen over the last several years. The amount of capital flows into the United States relative to other countries has been phenomenal, have dramatically outperformed both on a flow basis and a performance basis other economies around the world over the last several years. And it's hard to see how that's going to change dramatically due to tariffs. Because again, if you're saying I won't invest in the United States because of tariffs, well then how are you going to invest in Europe? How are you going to invest in China? How are you going to invest in Canada? They all have tariffs. So if tariffs are going to keep you from investing in the country, then you got to knock out all the other countries that have tariffs as well. And I think that's an important point that I want to make here if I didn't do it at the beginning. A lot of times people think in absolute terms, it's good or it's bad. But I'm an investor and I'm a capitalist. And so I look at, it's not all good or it's not all bad. It's a relative game. I am going to invest money. It's only a matter of where I'm going to do it. So it's not a decision of where, whether I'm going to invest or not. It's a matter of where is my capital going to be treated the best. So if you have 4 bad choices, one of them is going to be the best of the 4. And that worst of the 4 will get the majority of the capital. And so I think that's something that's important for people to look at. If you're looking around at currencies and you say, well, the dollar's horrible. Okay, I agree with you. Which ones are better? Find me a better one, right? Or if you think that the U.S. has too many tariffs, okay, find me another country that doesn't have tariffs. If you think the U.S. government is mean and overly regulatory and doesn't have your best interest in heart, okay, find me another government that treats you better. And I think when you do that relative analysis, it's just really hard for me to find a place other than the United States that on a relative basis is better than placing my capital in the United States. And the last thing I'll say on this is sometimes I have been accused of being an American exceptionalist. I think the U.S. is the greatest place in the world, and I think Americans are just smarter than everybody else. And that's not the case at all. Like I have friends all over the world. I've traveled all over the world. I've done business all over the world. In many ways, the U.S. has squandered its goodwill around the world, and in many ways, we've made many mistakes that are foolish. But the way the system is designed, and the natural resources and the natural advantages that the United States have, despite all of the problems and all the mistakes we've made, still make it an attractive place on a relative basis. And the only proof you need of that is you count the number of people over the last few years who have risked life and limb to get into the United States, either across the southern border or across the coming from Cuba to Miami, or coming in from Canada to the United States. People still want to get into the United States and still want to do business in the United States. And as a result, that makes the dollar attractive relative to other currencies.
And I guess what you just described is also a very good explanation why many of those ideas that a BRICS currency, a gold-backed or commodity-backed new currency will replace it in the very immediate. That's always the argument by many of those people who push the argument that it's going to happen in the immediate future. As you said, will it happen at some point? Potentially, probably. As you also said in a recent podcast, right? Every leading currency was replaced at some point. But many of those theories, it seems to me, are very often pushed more by a ideological desire to see the United States go down and they'll be punished because they're mean and all those things. And again, that's partially not wrong. Like every country, if they pursue the national interest, not everything they do is morally on the up and up. But simply based on the fundamentals that you just so dispassionately described, this is very unlikely, if not impossible, to happen in the short to medium run.
That's right. And, again, my main thing has been not that the United States will always be the global leader, that will always be the global hegemon, that the US dollar will always be the global reserve currency. We know from history that all these things eventually change. My main point has been those things will not change without great chaos and volatility happening along with it. And during that great chaos and volatility, I think the US dollar is going to rise versus other currencies rather than fall versus other currencies. I'm not saying these things can't happen. I'm not saying these dramatic changes can't happen. We are living in historic times. It's absolutely fascinating to be involved right now in what's going on. And I think, there's that famous saying, you go years where nothing happens, and then you go days where decades happen. And I think that's a perfect example right now. And I think big changes are happening. But I think the people who automatically think that just because big changes are happening, that means the U.S. is going to lose or is going to get the worst end of the stick on it, I think that's a naive assumption if you're going to, it's okay to have that as a possibility, but to apply a high probability to the United States, quote unquote, losing in that scenario, I think is to misunderstand the facts of the matter.
And you made a very good point before you quoted Lenin as a capitalist. You made an
You have to understand the other side, right?
Very good, well said. You made this great point that when you think in absolutes, things can very quickly look problematic. But if you look at them in relative terms, it's easier to pick and choose between the best possible option. And I think this is potentially another element. Whatever you think about the United States, if I would have to open a bank account outside of Europe, and let's say my options would be Russia, China, India, South Africa, and the United States. I think, unless I have to for my business, but just as you know, because I want to move some euro money out of Europe to be, to have a nest egg for whatever reason. I think most reasonable people would, and I would understand why, would pick the United States and not Russia, China, South Africa, India, or any other ones of the future or past BRICS members.
Yeah, I can give you a couple perfect examples here, and these are real life examples. It's not me just speculating. So I have a couple friends. One of them is from Mexico. One of them is from Brazil originally, but they both live in Miami, and they work for big global banks, and they cover Latin America and South America from an investment perspective, and they work with all the biggest, most successful and wealthiest families in Latin America and South America. And every single one of these families, their primary goal is to get money out of those countries and get them into the United States. Now, they still have assets in their home countries. They still run companies in their home countries. They still make investments in their local countries. But their number one goal is to get a chunk of their assets out of their home country, and the place they always want to go is the United States. That's one example. The other example is I just met a guy a couple weeks ago. He's from Australia, he works in Melbourne, he works in the commercial real estate business. They build office buildings. And he doesn't just build the buildings, he puts the chairs and the windows and the blinds, and so they furniture out the office. And they buy all of the furniture that they put in these buildings from China. But guess what the Chinese suppliers want to be paid in? They want to be paid in US dollars. They don't pay them in Australian dollars, they don't pay them in Chinese yuan, they pay them in US dollars. And then when he makes his money, guess what he does? He buys US T-bills. And the reason he buys US T-bills is because T-bills pay 4% compared to a lower rate that he would get in Australia. But then as the US dollar rises versus the Australian dollar, so if the US dollar rises versus the Australian dollar 5%, now he just made 9% for sitting in cash, basically.
Yeah.
Right? So again, these are real, and that is what supports, those types of things is what supports the United States economy and the US dollar. And the last point I'll make, these are just two examples, but I think especially in the US, people will hear about tax havens in Europe or in Asia, whether it's Monte Carlo or whether it's Guernsey or Singapore, the Cayman Islands. But what most people don't know, or perhaps don't know, is that for people outside the United States, the biggest tax haven in the world is the United States. In other words, the U.S. has policies that allow other countries, you have to jump through hoops. I'm not saying you don't have to. I'm not saying it's easy. Yeah. But a number of states within the United States have different trust businesses set up that capture this flow from these South American families, these European families, these Asian families who want to invest in the United States. And you know what? The U.S. does not report back to those home countries. When an American puts money in Switzerland, the U.S. mandates that Switzerland report that back to the IRS. When a Brazilian invests money in the United States, the IRS does not report back to the Brazilian tax authority. So it's not a double-way street. So is there hypocrisy involved? There's absolutely hypocrisy involved. But again, that's the way the world works. You don't have to like it. It's important to understand it.
What you said, it reminds me a little bit, I think it was Albert Marco who once jokingly said, the days there when the dollar ends, when Latin American cab drivers and prostitutes no longer accept US dollars. He said this is
listen, I mean, that's the truth. I was just in Colombia a couple of weeks ago. I literally stepped off the plane, walked up to a counter and bought a Coke, and I used dollars to do it. Coca-Cola, not the other kind of Coke.
I'm glad you clarified this. So I cannot let you go, since we're already talking about beverages. Now, I cannot let you go, Brent, before you tell us what is the milkshake theory.
Oh yeah, okay. So it's really kind of a combination of everything we've been talking about. I mean, the dollar milkshake theory is something that I came up with. I think it was back in 2018 when I first kind of started talking about it, and then it was really, over the next couple of years. I mean, I was still trying to figure it all out, and even today I'm still trying to figure it out. I don't claim to have all the answers, but it was my way of explaining what I thought was going to happen. And it's important to kind of understand what I do. I invest money on behalf of other individuals, and my clients are typically very successful, very wealthy, very smart people, but they are not necessarily investors, or they don't have the time to invest, or they don't have the interest, and so they hire me to do that for them. And so when I'm explaining to them what our strategy is or what I think I'm going to happen, I can't talk to them like they're a finance professional or a monetary policy expert. I have to talk to them in just simple terms that they're going to understand. And again, it's not because they're not smart, it's just that this isn't their line of work. And so, I came up with this idea that, the rest of the world, because of the design of the system, and because the U.S. is the biggest market, and because it's the biggest military, and because it has the most, the biggest consumer market that people want to trade with, that money would get sucked into the United States. And if there was a crisis, it would happen even more so. And the reason I got the name from a movie. There's a movie called There Will Be Blood, and it's about this ruthless oil baron, and he's doing this potential deal with his neighbor. His neighbor wants this guy to buy his land, and the neighbor says, if you buy my land, you can have all the oil that's underneath it. And the guy says, the oil baron says, well, here's the thing. I don't really have to buy your land because I have a straw. And if all I have to do is put the straw down, into the ground on my side of the fence, and I can suck all that oil up into my side, and I don't have to pay you anything. And I thought that was a pretty good analogy for the global economy. After 2008, and really again after 2020, the whole world started printing money. The whole world did bailouts. The whole world did stimulus. And an incredible amount of liquidity was created. But most of that liquidity ended up getting sucked up into the United States for many of the reasons that we've talked about already. And I think that that's what's likely to happen in the future. And so to me, that's the United States and the US dollar drinking the rest of the world's milkshake. And I don't know for sure that will continue, but I don't see any reason why it won't. And to me, that's the best analogy I could come up with for just simply explaining the dynamics that I think exist in the global economy.
As a concluding question, if we will look a little bit ahead, let's say 3, 4, 5, 10 years, what are some of the things that you think will be potentially, I'm asking you to speculate a little bit, that you consider to be some of the most significant events, both in the financial markets, but also geopolitically and macroeconomically?
Well, I actually think a couple of those are going on right now today. And I'll give you a quick example. I'll try to make this quick. I know you're probably running out of time.
No, I have plenty of time, so I think...
Okay, well, what time is it? How much time? We've got 5 or 10 more minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting for me is that when I went in college and grad school, I studied global economics, not just finance, but political science, global economics, and I studied international business. And as part of that, they made us learn how the world, quote unquote, works from an operational perspective. And what I mean by that is we referred to this a little bit when we talked about Bretton Woods, coming out of World War II. But Bretton Woods is only one part of it. What was really established after World War II was a whole system of institutions, both American and foreign, that were referred to as the rules-based order. And it laid out a groundwork for the way the United States as the global hegemon would interact with other countries around the world. They created the International Monetary Fund, they created the World Bank, they created the United Nations. And then there's also a number of smaller institutions below those, not just in the United States, but in many other countries, that kind of work within this framework of the way The West won World War II, and so the West kind of put these rules in place. And the interesting thing about the rules-based order is it was a way to foster global trade, to foster peace, to increase productivity, to decrease inequality. And there's a lot of truth to that, and a lot of good things came out of this rules-based order. But the other side of the coin is that the rules-based order is a system of control. And it was a way for those in power to stay in power. And if you went against the rules-based order, things typically did not end well for you. And I can give a couple different examples, whether it was Vietnam or whether it was Iraq or whether it's Iran or Venezuela, Russia in some cases. And so but that was the way, and then U.S. aid was a big part of that. The United States would give a lot of foreign aid, but then, behind the scenes, they would say, we're going to give you this foreign aid, but then you're going to do your projects in this way. So it was kind of a double-edged sword. Well, what's going on now is Trump is saying, that's not the way we're going to do business anymore. We're still going to be the big guy at the top of the pyramid, but we're no longer going to cloak it under this rules-based order, and we're not going to agree to these treaties that don't put the United States first. From now on, the rules still exist, but we're writing the rules. And I'm not, and if you don't like it, too bad. That is a monumental shift from the traditional rules-based order. And I've written, I think you asked me about my Substack. I have a new Substack that I started writing. I've been my first 3 things I've written about are about this exact topic. And then, not only that, but then it goes into the U.S. State Department and the way the U.S. State Department interacts with other countries. That's changing dramatically. And it also has to do with the U.S. aid, which I just mentioned, and the way the U.S. gives foreign aid. It relates back to what I said earlier in the conversation, that we're not going to have a different policy for U.S. aid, the State Department, the military, trade agreements, monetary policy, social policy. There's no longer 6 different strategies. There is one strategy now. And if it doesn't further the interests of the United States, it's not happening. And every dollar that we give away is going to have strings attached to it. Now, it's always kind of been that way a little bit, but now it's explicit and it's in the open. And it's maybe not the polite way to do things, but this is the way Trump is going to do things. And that is a monumental shift from the way things have been done for the last 60, 70, 80 years. And so I think that has profound impacts for 5, 10 years from now. I think that the United States is going to go for a Monroe Doctrine on steroids. And what I mean by that is, despite the short-term bluster between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, I think that those ties are going to become closer than ever. I think Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, South America, perhaps even Venezuela is going to become a part of that. I call it Fortress America, not just the United States of America, not just Northern America, but South America as well. And so I think what happens over the next 5 to 10 years is the world goes from being one globalized economy to being regionalized. And the U.S. will have its block. There'll be another block in China, another one with Russia. And I don't think it's going to be, some people refer to this as multipolar, as opposed to just one unipolar thing. I can't rule out that there won't be multipolar, but I don't think it's going to be a case where the poles are equal. I think by the U.S. doing this, it actually raises their status versus the rest of the world. Maybe not on a likability standpoint, but just on a pure power standpoint, I think the U.S. actually gains versus the rest of the world in this scenario. But it's going to be much more transactional. It's going to be much more, we'll do this for you, but you're going to do this for us. It'll be clearly stated. It won't be as, behind the scenes. And so and as a result, I don't think it will be as peaceful of a world. It could be. It could actually lead to more peace, but I think the process of getting there leads to much volatility is the only way I can think of to say it. So to me, that's the biggest thing. And I think in that interim, I think the dollar will get much stronger. I think when the dollar gets much stronger, it will cause, along with the change of the rule-based order, it will cause a lot of volatility. And then I think there will be some kind of a reset. And I don't know if it's a full Bretton Woods 2 or Bretton Woods 3 type reset for a global economy and a global currency, or if it becomes a more regionalized currency. But the point I want to stress is during that transition, I think the dollar gets stronger, not weaker. And I think the U.S. on a relative basis gets stronger, not weaker. And then my hope is that on the other side of it, we have a more fair, balanced, and nice world. I try not to put too much of what I want to see in these things because I kind of try to focus on what's actually going to happen. But that's kind of how I see things developing.
I mean, that strikes me as a very realistic scenario. Do you think it would be fair to argue that potentially this could be an American Renaissance? But if you look at the Western Hemisphere, resources in Canada, let's say Venezuela comes back in the fold, the potential both human resources, innovation, but also natural resources, a lot of what you just described, and I think none of this is unrealistic. Incidentally, I recently wrote an article exactly along these lines, just I didn't flesh it out as detailed as you just did. But all of that points precisely, as you said, to an America that's A, potentially more powerful, but also B, much clearer in its purpose, which an optimist might say, and I like to be an optimist, makes diplomacy easier. Because if I can say something provocative, isn't diplomacy in a certain sense also transactional? Meaning that good diplomacy means that both parties get off the table and think that they are better off than they were before. Now, diplomacy sounds much nicer, but a transaction is just that, right? It's a give and take where both sides profit in a certain way. And one of the things is, I know, because I don't want to keep this too long, but I'm so curious what you think about this, that always bothered me about US foreign policy in the past was there is no shame in pursuing your own national interest. But the fact that the United States very often, and I'm sure the intention was very noble, but they tried to cloak it in, it's a building democracy, it's for humanitarian rights, it's for human rights. Then you become, then it seems hypocritical, right? If you say we do this because it serves our national interest, as you said before, you can say I like it, I don't like it, but I understand why I do it. But when you do something for a national interest, but then you say, oh, no, it actually is for universal rights and it's for building democracy. I think then you annoy people, because if you try to be holier than thou, but you actually are not, that's actually more annoying than if you just say, we know we're the biggest bully on the block, and if you as you said before, if you catch our eye in a bad way, it might end bad for you. That seems to me maybe less pleasant, but significantly more honest, and also for the other parties easier to deal with.
So I totally agree with you. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So first of all, I'll say everything that we're talking about right now, especially the last kind of 10 minutes, if the listeners are enjoying this, I would encourage them to check out my Substack, because this is what I've been writing about so far.
Yes, please do.
I've been writing about this so far, and the way I titled my Substack is it's the intersection of global markets, geopolitics, and the madness of crowds, and where they interact with each other. And so far, I've just been writing on the geopolitical part of it, because that's kind of what's going on right now. I am going to write about the financial side of it as well. But the reason I'm enjoying this conversation is that's exactly the things I've been talking about, because I really don't think there's anything more important going on right now. The second thing I'll say is I do think it's possible. I don't know. I mean, no probabilities are 100%. But I know there's a lot of people out there who think this only ends in tears for the United States. And I would caution against that, because I think it is possible there is an American Renaissance. I would encourage you and your listeners to read a book called The Rise of America. A friend of mine wrote it, a guy named Marin Katusa. He wrote it a couple years ago, and it's talking about this exact topic, everything that you were writing about and what we're just discussing right now. And the last point I'll make is, I used to live in San Francisco. We moved, my family and I moved to Puerto Rico 3 years ago. My son went to a very progressive school in San Francisco, a great school. And, we knew the teachers. We were friends with the teachers. He learned a lot. I don't have anything bad to say about the school. But it was a school where there weren't a lot of clearly defined rules. And there was a lot of, they tried to get rid of inequality, and there was no celebration of birthdays, and you couldn't say Merry Christmas. And, so it was a very... we're one big happy family. We're one world. There's no individuality. It was just a different mindset. And then we moved to Puerto Rico, And my son goes to a great school here, and he really likes it, and he's popular, and he's learning a lot. But there's much more clearly defined rules here. There's no like saying one thing and doing another. Like, this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. And he, when we moved here, he was 13 years old. And I remember him saying to me, I like it better here because I know what the rules are. I understand clearly what we're doing and why we're doing it. There's no more ambiguity. There's no more cloak and dagger. And I thought that was pretty profound for a 13-year-old to kind of pick up on that. But it has a lot to do with what you're saying right now. It might not be the nicest way to do things. It might be a little stuck in the past. But I think in some ways people appreciate it. And it's easier to understand. And it removes some of, not all of, there's always going to be hypocrisy when governments are involved. But it helps to remove some of the hypocrisy involved in it.
All right, Brent, on that note, let me just ask you, what's the name of your podcast?
Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. It's on YouTube. We do it every week on Sunday.
The name of your Substack, please.
SantiagoCapital.substack.com.
And I think your Twitter handle is also Santiago Capital.
You can find me by Santiago Capital. The actual handle is at Santiago AU Fund. But if you type in Santiago Capital and you look for a white seashell, that's me.
Excellent. We also put all these links. You can find all of it in the description of this video. You also find it in the article that accompanies it on the Brussels Signet homepage. And I can only implore you to check it out. I think you heard in this conversation. Brent, it was an absolute pleasure. I hope that we can get you on again. These are just, the world is like this foggy place, and every time I read your stuff or I listen to you, that I can see contours in the fog, right? I can see where the guardrails are, and where I could step off and drop into the water, and where everything is. So this was once again wonderful, Brent. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again.